Thank you, Owen. Bonjour. Merci à tous et toutes qui ont organisé cet symposium intéressant et important concernant les lois canadiennes concernant les gaz à effet de serre. I would like to the extent that I can, integrate my presentation this morning with some of the wonderful presentations we've already heard, beginning with a brief elaboration on the excellent survey of the international legal framework that Marc-Antoine Racicot presented yesterday on behalf of Sophie Lavallee. It's perhaps not widely understood if we consider the topic of agriculture, that food and agriculture have figured prominently in the international arrangements under which we are all laboring. The original UN FCCC overarching objective of stabilization of greenhouse gas concentrations was presented in the context of ensuring that food production is not threatened. The Paris Agreement refers specifically to increasing the ability to adapt to the diverse impacts of climate change and foster climate resilience and low greenhouse gas emissions development in a manner that does not threaten food production. In the IPCC special report that came out last month and after I had put my presentation together, a number of scenarios concerning a 1.5 degree possible future were outlined, including scenarios that involve implications for the agricultural sector. And with reference to the agricultural sector, there is a tendency to flag non-CO2 emissions, notably nitrous oxide and methane, both specifically addressed in the context of this sector and more generally, as we know, because from a greenhouse gas impact perspective, they are stronger or more powerful gases than CO2. But everything, again, as we know, is consolidated into a CO2 equivalent framework. In a general sense, if we work with IPCC sectors and an understanding of agriculture, which, as I hope to indicate in the course of this presentation, has been an evolving and challenging one, we will find an identification of agriculture as a sector and an attempt by participating countries, including Canada, to attribute some proportion of their domestic GHG emissions to that sector as designated and understood. Ballpark terms, Canada has been attributing 10% of our national emissions to the agricultural sector. Here is a modestly more updated chart indicating roughly the same thing. In terms of public discussion of the agricultural sector, I think overwhelmingly attention has focused on the question of adaptation, as in how will agricultural and food production systems adapt and respond to the impacts of climate change. But I'm going to attempt in this presentation to focus on mitigation issues in the agricultural context. This image is intended in a simple schematic way to illustrate some of the processes involved in the relationship between agricultural activity and the greenhouse gas situation broadly. Three simple points. Multiple gases emerge from multiple sources in the agricultural context. Interestingly as well, agriculture has a potential to serve a storage or retention function in relation to greenhouse gases. And also interestingly, from the perspective of the way we approach policy questions in agriculture, you'll see an omission or elimination of direct energy use from machinery in the sector. There's no tractor in this picture. Defining or understanding the agricultural sector is an ongoing and important challenge. Ongoing and important for a variety of ways. Yesterday, Isabelle Vachon indicated in relation to Part 1 of the new federal legislation that farming has an exemption. If an activity is exempt from otherwise applicable regulations, we're interested in being able to define the boundaries or to circumscribe the extent of that exempt activity. Farming is defined in the new federal legislation. Agricultural operations are defined in other related pieces of legislation, including here some legislation from BC dealing with waste control. There's a typo in this slide which I have to address and apologize for. If you read about halfway down, you will come to that typo. I did not intend to write F's as in effing, but G as in egging and eggs. So for anyone of public school age listening in, my apologies. We can define farming in the old MacDonald sense. Immediately an image comes to mind. But because we are lawyers, we are focused, again, if I can come back to the boundary issue, on what is in and what is out in terms of the way the regulatory regime applies. Without answering these questions, let me offer you a few things to contemplate and reflect upon. Not necessarily in relation to the legislative language I've put on the screen, but in relation to other regimes at the provincial level. Christmas trees are grown. Are they grown on farms as farming? Tobacco is a crop. Fish farms are called fish farms, but are they farms? For purposes of these arrangements. Canada addresses the agricultural sector directly in the context of developing our nationally determined contributions. If we are seeking to achieve the overall goal, it is understood and anticipated that the different sectors of the economy will each, for their part, make some kind of contribution toward the targeted reduction. In general, I think we have understood agriculture as being a comparatively small, modest area of activity from a greenhouse gas production perspective. Some numbers came out in yesterday's presentation. Sharon Masher in particular indicated or presented a 5% agriculture number for British Columbia and an 8% number for Alberta. So you say to yourselves, yawn, 5%, 8%, not a big deal. The difference between 5 and 8 is not all that great. But the 8 is in Alberta, not in British Columbia. Alberta was the province with the large overall level of greenhouse gas emissions. So 8% in Alberta may be a number of some consequence. I think you'll see in the next couple of years some other numbers in discussion. Manitoba has identified the agricultural sector as understood in that province as responsible for 30%, 30% of provincial emissions. We will watch unfolding the next round of the Green Budget Coalition campaign for federal attention to climate change challenges, and their current proposal describes the agriculture and agri-food sector as a 30%, 30% contributor to national emissions. I'm going to illustrate a little bit later on how you might move in the direction of those numbers. Agriculture is indeed addressed in the Pan-Canadian framework, clustered, packaged, gathered together in the forestry, agriculture, and waste sector. Put up your hand if you work in that sector, forestry, agriculture, and waste. Maybe we work in parts of it, but clustering it is not, in my opinion, necessarily a helpful indicator from a policy development perspective. Nonetheless, in relation to agriculture as an element of forestry, agriculture, and waste, there are some activities to address. Greenhouse gas storage, the development of biofuels, enhancement of energy efficiency within the activities that are carried out in the sector. I'd like to look at some provincial regimes briefly, beginning with Ontario up here on the screen. I won't go into this in detail, but I will indicate that Ontario's ministry responsible for agriculture has devoted significant resources to identifying energy efficiency opportunities for participants in that sector. But they are not targeted at farms. They might be targeted at poultry producers or blueberry growers or grain producers. Highly specialized indications of how you can increase your efficiency if your operation involves a fan, for example, or the drying of a crop before it enters the transportation stream. Alberta has also been extremely active and has explicitly adopted or promoted a framework called CSA, Climate Smart Agriculture, echoing a conceptualization of the challenge that has been put on the international stage by the Food and Agriculture Organization, a very broad-based initiative. I'd like to look now at some of the activities that are taking place in this sector to give you an idea of some of the things that are going on. From a land management perspective, there are initiatives and efforts designed at enhancing the retention of soils as carbon sinks or locations of carbon storage. This involves guidance on crops, on seeding practices, but particularly on questions of tillage or the disturbance and disruption of the soil, which has the potential, depending on how you do it, to release more or less of potentially harmful greenhouse gases. This is simply another illustration of those initiatives underway. Livestock, separate from, different from raising crops, has been another targeted area of activity. This is initially I'm going to focus on the front end of the Clean Cow project, and for those of you who are having trouble reading, this is a commitment to a clean cow, not a green cow. The issue or objective or challenge is to transform cattle from high methane producers to lower methane producers by making them more efficient producers of either meat or milk and dairy products. That is a dietary intervention that brings a great deal of scientific learning right to the food system of beef and dairy cattle across the country. And from a technical perspective, we're addressing the process of enteric fermentation, which produces methane or contributes to methane production by cattle. From a data perspective, I don't want to talk about these in detail, but my objective is to indicate to you the extent to which detailed statistical information is available. Here is some information from a site maintained by the Commission for Environmental Cooperation, mentioned in the last session, indicating overall agricultural emissions of methane in Canada and suggesting that they come variously from enteric fermentation, which I've just mentioned, manure, or field burning of crops. If you want to proceed more deeply into the enteric fermentation question, this is methane release from livestock. Here is a chart. The line on top is cattle, indicating that cattle are the leading contributors of this gas from this sector, and at the bottom, some information relating to other livestock. To get more deeply into enteric fermentation emissions, if I've whetted your appetite, by further subcategory, you can examine the data that is available. Up to and including enteric emissions from camels and llamas in Canada by year. I mention this simply because Natalie Schallafer yesterday had talked about the measurability of some of the activities that we're undertaking, and I think in that context, it may be useful to know what's available. Manure management as another on-farm activity which has implications for greenhouse gas production and emission. We have tended to address manure management in a Canadian context over the last few decades from the perspective of managing pollution that has the capacity to harm rivers, lakes, and streams. It's been a water protection initiative, but it has had the effect in certain jurisdictions and at certain scale of gathering or capturing manure that would otherwise flow into natural waterways. In the United States, there have been regulatory initiatives intended to capture and control methane from large-scale agricultural operations. We are tracking well behind that in Canada, but as you'll see, the potential exists and some activity is underway. Also in relation to agriculture, an emphasis has been developing on biofuels. I think we're all familiar with the discussion over time. The Quebec Climate Change Plan, as it was set up for the 2013-2020 period, flagged agriculture as a sector and indicated that the province of Quebec would promote greater efficiency in energy use on farms and simultaneously promote the use of renewables. Not long ago, Quebec developed a renewables regulation. I'm not immediately up to date on its status, but the language is in place. There are some contexts in which, as a matter simply of taking advantage of the opportunities available, energy producers have drawn on the supply of manure and resulting methane production to integrate what would otherwise be a greenhouse gas emission into a biogas facility servicing a community, in this case Lethbridge, where there is also an attempt to if I can again refer back to Arlene Kwasniak's presentation yesterday, to integrate methane from municipal landfill with methane from on-farm manure into a biogas production facility. In British Columbia, the national energy and fuel distributor Fortis has some significant projects underway, again intended to take farm-based methane and introduce it into the natural gas system. So those are issues around capturing waste from the agricultural sector and turning it into fuel. There are also initiatives in some subcomponents of the agricultural sector to target a biofuel market at the level of producing fuel rather than capturing waste. There's the on-farm stuff and there's the off-farm stuff, and I do want to touch a little bit about this. We have here a locomotive. Ordinarily, locomotive emissions will be picked up and reported in the transportation sector. But to the extent that the transportation sector is hauling agricultural produce, efficiencies in transportation have significant potential contributions to make to reducing energy use that, from a national Canadian perspective, is profoundly significant in terms of transporting agricultural produce and exporting overseas. Here's another, not necessarily on-farm activity, that offers a significant opportunity. This is an advertisement or a promotional piece of material for a California-based company which is proposing to produce what it describes as natural coatings for fruit and vegetables. The ultimate magic, if you get there, is a bunch of bananas coming to exactly the degree of ripeness that you like, one on Monday, one on Tuesday, one on Wednesday, one on Thursday, one on Friday. But the broader significance, if this works, is lower shipping of fruit and vegetables that ultimately may end up being wasted, and therefore waste reductions, and therefore less methane, and simultaneously reduced refrigeration and therefore less energy use in the transportation of agricultural products. Not on-farm activity, but food-related activity. To put some of this back in a broader, international, at least, continental perspective, the Federal Sustainable Development Strategy addresses our relationship in a North American context with the United States and Mexico, and contains, for the current period, a specific commitment to reduce methane from agriculture and food waste with reference to the North American Climate, Clean Energy, and Environment Partnership. Another of those below-the-radar, large-scale, continent-wide partnerships and relationships that have emerged. So if I can now touch base with Jean Piette's presentation at the end of yesterday afternoon, he had indicated that Quebec's ambitions moving to the 2050 period rather than 2020 and 2030 call for a very significant increase in ambition from the perspective of greenhouse gas emission reductions. If we're going to do that, we need to be moving from a sectoral focus or a facility-based focus to a system-wide focus. And thus, I think this idea that the agricultural or agri-food sector or system will play a larger role in greenhouse gas emissions reduction is coming into focus. By way of closing, I offer the observation that it is extremely unlikely that we can eat our way to a climate-secure future, but we do need a broader awareness of the relationship between breakfast and climate change. Thank you.